Welcome everyone back to the YouTube channel of All Saints with Holy Trinity here in Loughborough. I'm hoping we are broadcasting live to the nation. I've been having some fun and games with my internet this morning. So hopefully, God willing, and courtesy of BT and their optic fibres or whatever it is they have, we will be with you this Tuesday lunchtime. If you've just found us somewhat accidentally, then let me introduce myself. I'm Wendy. I'm the rector of Loughborough's Historic Parish Church. And each Tuesday lunchtime, I take my little sermon musing and preparations online, and I invite different guests to join me for something of a conversation about the scripture readings that are coming up on Sunday. So the scripture readings we look at are those set from the Revised Common Lectionary, which is a 3-year cycle of readings shared by a variety of denominations all around the world. We don't tend to look at the psalm we haven't on the Muse due to time, but we take the gospel, the epistle, and at the minute we're following the what's called the continuous or the continuous choice of the Old Testament or Hebrew scripture reading. So that's what we're doing. And if you're with us live this Tuesday lunchtime, we would love you to join in. So do please log in if you're able to do that to YouTube, use the comments, say hello and join in with the conversation. I can see that Hannah's here. Hi, Hannah. Hannah's a real regular here. So do please join in, Hannah, and others who join in as we go along. Well, I'm delighted that I have 2 returning faces this week and 1 new person. I said there were going to be some exciting visitors to the Muse this term. So I will reveal them to you by the magic gallery button. And while I put into the comments what we're looking at today, they're going to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their context for ministry. And if they've written a book, they will mention it because you may be interested in buying it. Over to you guys.
Hi everyone, I'm Miranda Threlfall-Holmes. I'm team rector of the St Luke in the City team, which is a group of 3 churches, one from the evangelical tradition, one from the off-the-scale liberal progressive tradition, and one from the Anglo-Catholic tradition, all working together as one team in Liverpool city centre. Funnily, you should mention it, Wendy. I have written a book recently, which people may be interested in. How to Eat Bread, 21 Nourishing Ways to Read the Bible. Published by Hodder just the other month. Do buy it and tell all your friends. As I say, I'm a vicar in 3 churches, team rector with quite a big lay team. We have an LGBT congregation, Open Table, which I mentor. And we like trying experimentation, and we favour quite a conversational approach to sermons. So certainly through lockdown, we've been discussing the readings in morning prayer, live on Facebook, and in church we tend to have a bit of an open mic approach to the sermons. So I might tend to give a sermon starter, but then we hand over the microphone to anyone that wants to. So we live by the seat of our pants in terms of discussing the Bible.
Hi, I'm Charlie Stiles. I'm rector of Lutterworth in Leicestershire, pretty much in the middle of the country. And at this time of the year, particularly aware that we're pretty much as far away from the seaside as possible. So looking forward to our seaside holiday coming up. I'm at the church where John Wycliffe did my job about, more than 600 years ago, and was one of the first places in this country to train lay preachers, certainly out of the traditional church, sort of beyond the, and sort of normal people going out with the word. And so we've tried to kind of continue some of that tradition. And one of the things at the moment we're particularly been enjoying is getting back face to face. I think what Miranda says about conversation is brilliant. And the weird thing about being online for the most part was conversation and back and forth was really hard to do well. And so it's just been really good being back together. And I also come off the back of a children's summer club where we spent the week with Daniel and as many children as we could fit into our local Methodist church last week. So I'm a little bit weary, but I've got a holiday in a week. So I'm going to leave it all out there on the pitch today.
Hi everybody, I'm Glenn Marshall. I'm a Baptist minister, currently serving as co-principal of Northern Baptist College, which is how old are we? Nearly 250-year-old college, which has been serving churches in the north of England. Currently, we are part of a federation of colleges known as Luther King Centre, based in Manchester, south central Manchester. And as well as being co-principal of the Baptist College, I teach courses in preaching and mission as part of our various degree programs. And we've just come off the back of an MA summer school looking at preaching, where I was advocating the benefits of collective preparation for preaching. So it's just good to, for once in my life, to actually practice what I preach. I've been preaching since I was 16, with an occasional pause for breath in the intervening 45 years. So I love doing this. I love reading the Bible, and it's just nice to get a chance to join in and do a bit of collective prep. That's great.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Glenn. Well, I feel like I'm surrounded by real experts in their field today. So I'm just going to sit back and kind of field the conversation really. So that's what I'm going to do. But we're going to dive in and we're going to take a look at our scriptures that are set for this coming Sunday. We always start with the gospel reading because I always think beginning and ending with Jesus is a pretty safe bet, really, when you're looking at the scriptures. So if you were here last week and you've been following the lectionary, you will know that over these few weeks, we really dive in to the part of John's gospel that unpacks this idea that Jesus says he is the bread of life. So it's John 6, verse 35 sets the scene, and then it jumps to 41 to 51. I don't know about you, Glenn, but as I read this, I've got hymns in my ears, about being raised up on the last day, and I won't sing and break Zoom or the internet, but some powerful images here. When you look at this text, Glenn, what are you really drawn to as you look at it this time round?
I think what I'm drawn to primarily is the notion of Jesus as the one who sustains the life which is to come. So the purpose of the bread of heaven, it seems, is to sustain us and to lead us into what we're told here is eternal life, or the life of the age which is to come. Jesus as the key to living in God's kingdom, in other words. And I think if I was going to focus on something in this passage, it would be that notion of what does it mean to focus on, come to, believe in, trust in, being drawn to, and to be sustained by Jesus as individually and collectively we try to live in the midst of this world, the life of God's coming world, the life of the age which is to come. I must confess, though, that the passage is a bit of a mess. If I was marking this rather than preaching on it, I'm not sure it would get great marks, really. It could do with a good editor. There's a right kind of jumble of ideas side by side there, which gives us lots to pick from, but it's rather hard to settle. There are bits of it that trouble me a bit, so I'm not entirely comfortable with some of the hints about predestination that you might read in there, about only those whom God draws, whom the Father draws to Jesus. And yet that at the same time is offset by a rather inclusive set of words like the whoever, the world, anyone. There's a bit of a tension there. Whenever there's a tension, I've always gone with the principle of go for the bit that I like. So I like the inclusive bit. I like the welcoming bit. So I'm going to focus on that, I think, and leave God to worry about my lack of consistency. It seems to me if God can't be bothered to be consistent with the Bible, why do I have to be with my theology? So yeah, cracking passage, loads of stuff in it. But for me, the heart of it is this notion that Jesus is the one who sustains us as we believe in him, come to him, trust him, are drawn to him by the Father. And that's where we find the resources to live the life that God is calling us into.
Sounds like a beautiful place to start. And I love that you've drawn out the tension that is in there, because John does muddle up his metaphors, so that it gets very, very rich and deep. And you do seem to have these two threads, don't you, of the exclusiveness and the it's for everybody, and how we sit in that, and how we preach out of that. Charlie, you've got a wry smile going on. Would you square that circle?
I think it's one of the things that makes John, both here and the Johanna letters, sort of both so much fun, but also so difficult. They don't work like kind of Paul's letters, where there's a kind of rational thread that normally these three paragraphs build to that conclusion and then lead to lead to point 3 and you follow on or something. But I think a lot of the time it's a sort of different way of thinking, so it can feel often like you're kind of spiraling or circling around something. I think one of the things I'd bring out of here would be the story. So the narrative of John 6 is the feeding and the bread of life, and then you get the grumbling, and it immediately evokes for me all the memories of Exodus. They've just been brought through the sea, rescued from the Egyptians, and they go, well, we're thirsty now. And then once there's miraculous water out of rock, and they go, right, we're hungry now. And then, only bread. We want meat. Like it just which is, I think, a very recognizable human trait that we're probably all quite used to. And so I think there's no accident that I think so much of what is going on across John 6, and obviously most of John's gospel, is picking up some of those Old Testament themes and going, yeah, you kind of got this before, but let me show you what it really means. And I think that's the big thing that we get here, which is, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that someone may eat of it and not die. So it's the whole kind of thing of, like, you've got all this Old Testament stuff of people in the wilderness, people out in the middle of nowhere being fed miraculously. Here's some bread, here's a physical illustration of that. But if you stop there, you've missed the point. And so you've got this wonderful thing of the new is better. Even though I think we can completely recognize in it ourselves as those who receive gifts and yet always focus on what we don't have. You get the new iPhone and it's about 2 months later they release the next one and you look forward to your upgrade. Or we're always looking, the other supermarket queue is always quicker. It's like that. We just always think that way. And right actually back to the original sin, it comes at its heart to a lack of acknowledgement of what we have received. And these are people right there with Jesus grumbling. It's astonishing when you think about it.
Yeah, the complaining that is at the heart of this. Maybe, do you have a very grumpy, complainy congregation, Charlie? Maybe don't answer that. Maybe.
No, I really don't. I really don't. No, we sacrifice them on the hill just outside Lutterworth every few months. Every time, no, we really don't. But I think I not acknowledge that myself, and I think as well, particularly coming out of COVID, being very grateful for preservation, for the church continuing, but it also feels very hard and actually can be very easy to say, but only if only we had this. And I think, counting your blessings is a bit of a cliche, but it would really help if we did it more.
Yeah. And go on, Miranda.
I found myself thinking about the Olympics as I was reading this. I've been watching the daily summary, and the cliche that I've noticed is whenever they interview people at the end, they always go, the message I have for people is if you only believe, it can happen. Look at me, I'm from a normal background and I only took up this sport 5 years ago, but if you only believe, it can happen. And I mean, it's interesting what Glenn says about the kind of two threads in this, because, that's true for that person. But of course, there's 40 other people who competed who it's not true for, who all believed, and it didn't happen for them. But I just wondered, thinking about that, and made me think, is there something in this passage about the relationship between belief and the removal of limitations? That whole kind of life-death thing, and the extent to which belief limits what we think is possible. And so we end up putting our own limits on ourselves because of what we believe is in the realms of the possible. And so when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, people start complaining, going, he can't say that. He's someone we know. He's a boy from down the road. It's not their belief about where God's grace can come from doesn't include someone whose parents they know. And actually our own, there's a lot of research, isn't there, about the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset and so on. And I'm not saying psychology can save us instead of Jesus, but actually I think Jesus really puts his finger on something that's not just a theological point, but is actually about how belief does change reality. And actually the beliefs that we have can limit us and lead to death metaphorically, as well as freeing us and liberating us and leading to a greater life.
That's a really interesting thought. Glenn, were you just going to come back in?
And just that idea of the way in which the people with whom Jesus is in discussion here, and many of us these days, we struggle to see the divine in the mundane, don't we? And there's that tension between, well, this is Joe and Mary's lad. How can he say that he comes from heaven? And again, it's part of the characteristics of John's gospel, isn't it? That it's simultaneously one of the most supernatural gospels, one of the most stereotypically spiritual gospels, and yet it's incredibly fleshy and earthy and ordinary. So the first miracle happens when Jesus gets nagged into doing something by his mum at a wedding.
Yes.
Just the ordinary stuff of everyday life, and wow, God's there. And I think part of the barrier to faith that Miranda is alluding to is that we often don't find it easy to see God in ordinary stuff like bread, ordinary stuff like aunties and uncles dancing at a wedding. And yet there it is, there it's to be found through Christ. You know, it's the word, the logos, the eternal articulation of all that the Father holds dear, made flesh and blood. And of course, that's one of the things that happens with this passage towards the end, where it gets a bit yucky, doesn't it? And sort of kind of overtones of cannibalism, because it's clearly not Eucharistic.
I'm glad we've gone there, Glenn.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, we find it much easier to assume to see God in the spectacular. I'm just thinking back to, you know, the beginning of lockdown when churches were closed, and a lot of people who don't go to church were moaning about the churches being closed, you know, as if God can only be found in a spectacular building, you know, with the soaring and, you know, and there's been a lot of moaning about choral music, hasn't there? You know, as if, you know, we might like it, but you know, it's like God can only be there if you're playing some beautiful Bach and are in a beautiful building. And actually, all that snide commentary about when the Archbishop of Canterbury celebrated communion in his kitchen, it's like, why couldn't he have done it in a proper chapel? You know, there's a huge resistance to accepting that the mundane can be sacred. Yeah. Just as you were talking, Glenn, I was thinking if I was preaching on this on Sunday, I might be inclined to use that Mary Oliver poem. You know, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be a few weeds in a parking lot. You know, just that sense that you don't have to find something beautiful and sublime to spark a connection with God. It could be anything. Just that sort of mindfulness of noticing the detail.
Yeah, sometimes sacramental theology fails because it's not sacramental enough. We're not prepared to allow the ordinary atoms to become vehicles for divine revelation and divine communion. And as somebody who comes from a tradition which is not particularly sacramental, I don't think I've ever been to a Baptist church that's played Bach. Very few Baptist churches which have been beautiful buildings either. I often find myself pushing the people to whom I speak to sort of say, the problem with certain forms of sacramental theology is that they limit it, and it needs to be, the sacrament needs to break out. It's the sacredness of stuff. It's the sacredness of ordinary stuff. And I think that's at the heart of this. I mean, for goodness sake, it's bread.
Yes. It's
bread. It's not foie gras. It's bread that Jesus offers us.
And I think, if I can just come back in as the token Anglo-Catholic on the call, is that there's something about if you hold sacramental ministry right, what you should be doing is allowing people to then see God in the ordinary beyond the sort of the ritualized bit. Because there is something, because as I read it, I'm just so take the offertory prayer that I would use, blessed are you, Lord God, through your goodness, we have this bread to set before you, which earth has given and human hands have made. It will become for us the bread of life. And really, for me, in the kind of worship that I lead in my context, those words are so important. I mean, I wonder if they're heard or whether they're just lost in the ritual. But I think if you inhabit that from a good place, that's what allows you, or can be a tool to helping you see the sacramental in the everyday. I think that's what I think. I just got a couple of comments from Hannah, who's joining in from home. She's particularly noticed a thing about the wilderness. She says, I wonder if when he says your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, I wonder if that's a deliberate mention of wilderness. Is he implying they're in a sort of wilderness too? And also the complaining, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, sounds like an overtired child. Maybe the people are feeling exhausted mentally and there is a need for food there. A kind of a feeding of body, mind and soul. Charlie, did you want to come back in? You've been sort of listening to Glenn and Miranda throwing this around.
Yeah, I think that is, we have got throughout John's Gospel like that wonderful poem. People often sort of, right at the beginning, the word became flesh. That's where it lands. It lands actually. We have seen him full of grace, the one who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The miracle of the incarnation is what flows throughout this, and actually that's where before we get onto sacramental theology, we need to start with incarnational theology, that God is God has made this, he's breathed his life into human beings, and then he even became one of us. That's how much he values sort of physical stuff, flesh. And that word just comes up. And that's why I think it's really important. This reading, wherever they've cut it today, verse 51 ends on, the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. He has become flesh, and he's going to give his flesh. You can't over spiritualize this. Or you really shouldn't anyway. You could try, but also again, I think the point of you can't almost under spiritualize it as well. It kind of goes against a lot of the kind of Gnostic ideas around at the time, the kind of dualism between kind of physical and spiritual, which I think we still do. We still do in many ways, whether we do it between religion and science or logic and faith or whatever it is. We separate a lot of those things, and we talk about, being saved for heaven when we die, or we end up being the churches that talk about being saved for earth now. And actually, it's all, and that's, I think, come back to what Glenn said earlier. It's that Jesus is the key to the life of the world to come that begins now. It's not a wait. Let's wait around for it till we're zapped. But actually, the beginning of that is now, or the beginning of that actually was then. Actually, we're part of it for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And the challenge for us as people who are seeking to live that life is we're living it in the midst of the world, which doesn't always welcome that kind of life. There's a resistance, there's a friction to living the life of the age to come in the midst of the present evil age. At the risk of sounding too dualistic. And it seems to me the key to that is that focus on Jesus. How are we enabled to live the life of the age to come, even in the midst of this age, which doesn't feel very heavenly? Well, the key is to come to feed on, to trust in. Now let's kind of play with the idea of what we mean by believing Jesus. It's not just about assenting to propositions about Jesus, it's trusting him enough to live his way. That's how we're sustained to be able to live the life of heaven on earth, the life of the age to come in the present. And for me, that's where I start, and I guess that's the key to this. Okay, can I drop in something that bugs me at this stage, Wendy?
Please do. We like a good being bugged and irritated.
But whether it bugs Miranda and Charlie as well, your ancestors as Jesus. Is Jesus distancing himself from the people that he's talking with? Aren't they your ancestors as well? And it's often been said, isn't it, that in places John's gospel is perhaps one of the most anti-Semitic of the gospels, and it's the gospel that Jewish friends seem to have more trouble with. The Jews are always sort of kind of negatively, and they're referred to collectively as the Jews. And it's almost as if Jesus here is denying the very solidarity which incarnation is all about by saying, oh, they were your ancestors. Yeah. Or is that just me reading too much into it?
That's interesting, because that does jar now you mention it, your ancestors. And I wonder, does it reflect something around, again, the letter is, it can be described as the most anti-Semitic, and it's very clear about kind of like blaming the Jews. So I wonder if that's part of that. Charlie, have you got a thought on that?
I think one of the keys might be the word father. So actually, when it says ancestors, same word as the word father. So I'm always a bit suspicious of any preacher that says in the original Greek, you'll find. But I do think that there, what you've got actually is you've got a contrast between Jesus talking about his father and then talking about your fathers. Okay. So I don't think he's saying that the Jewish ancestors weren't his ancestors or his fathers, but I think he's distinguishing there. If we were reading it in the original, or if we had a more literal translation, the ancestor word would be father, as well as the obvious word for my father in heaven. So I think his point is kind of there that he says, everyone who's heard and learned from the Father comes to me, everyone who's seen the Father. And then he goes, your fathers ate manna. So I wonder if that's part of it. Not trying to do down some of the other comments you make about anti-Semitism in the gospel, but I think that might be one of the keys here.
Interesting. Interesting. Thank you. Always good to sit with stuff that niggles, because sometimes there's an interesting theme there. And sometimes you just decide, I'm just going to duck it from the pulpit. That's the other way to deal with things that niggle. But interesting theme. Let's move on from the gospel, even though we may come back round to it. I think we'll go to Ephesians next, because in some way this is something of the outworking of the gospels. This is the living community of the church. We're having little sections from Ephesians over last week and next week. I think comes to the end of our little foray into Ephesians this time round in the lectionary. And I've lost my notes. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 25 to 5 verse 2, and it's really nice because it's been nice to each other. Charlie, play nicely, please. What do you make of this passage? Does this speak to you in your context?
So it's one of those things that is eminently, one of these bits of a letter that is eminently practical. It does what we should do. It's very good to throw at somebody else if they're not obeying it. You can always have a go at them and go, by the way, I'd like to quote Ephesians 4:25 at you. But I actually think it's that classic thing as well that we often do, which is when you cut up a letter, it starts with "so then." So I think that before you almost get into it, you've got to go back. And the chapter 4 begins, "I therefore, as a prisoner of the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you've been called." That's the flow. So it comes to the same stuff we've been talking about before in John. If you come to Jesus, if you put your faith in him, if you feed on him, and then you live according to that, if you enter into the life of the kingdom to come, of the world to come, if you're going to step into that, so then one of the things obvious to do is to put away falsehood. If you're going to follow the person who's full of grace and truth, put away falsehood. If you're going to put somebody who actually was angry, Jesus was angry, but actually didn't sin, then yes, be angry, but do not sin. Stealing, evil talk, all those sorts of things, and elsewhere around the passage, various other things around sort of sexual immorality or about serving one another in love. And so just before our section, actually, we've got the bit which says, you were taught to put away your former ways of your life, your old self, corrupt, deluded by its lust, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. And I think what often happens is when we get these sort of more, this is what you should do bits of the Bible, we kind of staple them on top. I mean, I've got a sermon illustration that I do about tree and fruit, where I have a tree and I start sellotaping pears to it. And you go, how do you get a tree to grow fruit? Well, you don't pop down the supermarket and buy some pears and sellotape them on and then go, hey, look, everybody, my tree is really successful this year. No, you nurture it, feed it, plant it, sun, water, all those things. And I think what can happen with these sorts of things, if we don't follow the flow and if we don't start with the gospel, we end up basically going into sort of more of a legalistic do this, don't do this thing, right. Which, of course, it does direct how we should live. But actually what he's saying here is he's saying, you've been changed inside, so be renewed in the spirit of your minds. Now clothe yourselves with the new self. And then, so if you're a thief and you've become a Christian, that's the point. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't be talking to thieves. Don't steal anymore. There should be a change, but this change is not if you want to come to Jesus, stop stealing. It's because you've come to Jesus, because you're feeding on this bread, stop stealing. And I don't think we can say that enough, because actually we slip into externals so easily. One, because I think it's often easier. It's easier sometimes to bolt on a bit of external thing that looks a bit like holiness.
Yes.
And also we are sort of judgmental in the sense of we make judgments on people all the time, and external things are a lot easier to judge than internal things. But I think we have to keep going back to, okay, if you've come and you've fed, what's going to be the outworking of this? If you are a tree rooted by streams of living water, what's going to be the fruit? And then you come, of course you do, to be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you. And that because the forgiveness thing only makes sense if you understand you as one who's been forgiven, so you forgive. If it is forgive one another so that you'll be forgiven, actually we're back into some sort of works righteousness, do it. And actually it's bolt on holiness rather than authentic, deep rooted holiness.
I love that illustration. I'm going to pinch that of them taping some fruit to me. I love that. I love that. Thank you. Miranda, yeah, you're responding with a round of applause. Is this a similar vein that you would go down?
Yeah, I was just saying as we started before we went live, I tend to avoid these sort of passages because I'm deeply sinful. My mind basically goes, oh, blah, 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 be nice to each other. Yeah, fine, boring. You know, so I'm very impressed that you could actually, that you actually made that sound interesting. Well done. Because it can so easily become, you end up feeling like you're in a school assembly, don't you? Sitting cross-legged on the floor with the head teacher haranguing you once again about how to be nice to each other. But yeah, absolutely, that idea of fruit and these things being natural when your roots are in the right place. I love that. I because I was ignoring all the blah blah be nice to each other bit, I ended up focusing on the kind of proverb, do not let your sun go down in your anger, which I'm fairly sure probably was already a proverb that's being quoted here. And it made me think about the examen and that Ignatian practice of reflecting on the day. And actually, I love what you said, Charlie. I hadn't thought about that before, about, you know, be angry, but don't sin. I think that's great. I'm definitely going to use that. But that sense of actually at the end of the day, just reflect on where the strong emotions have been is something that I've found really, really helpful since being introduced to it.
I'm going to go burn down the patriarchy.
I'm live. Could you just, sorry. I don't know if you heard that, but that was, I'm going to go burn down the patriarchy. Anyway, one of my...
That seems like a very good contribution.
Yeah, thanks for that, child. Right, sorry, Miranda, where were you?
I'd run out of steam.
I must have, one of the reasons I do like this passage is this very idea that obviously they must be being revolting to each other because they're being encouraged to forgive one another. And I always think that's a great encouragement because, you know, this stuff is real. Yeah, Christian community is messy. Glenn, you'd frozen on my screen for large parts of that, but I think that was the internet. But I presume your brain wasn't frozen.
Who knows? Let's see. So I think I agree. First of all, it's on the one hand, it's incredibly encouraging that this is so realistic about the realities of trying to live together as human beings, let alone as Christians. I think it's earlier in this passage in Ephesians where the author says, "Forbear one another," which is a lovely sort of kind of Bible-y, religiously kind of wordy. But it just means you're going to have to put up with one another. You're going to have to learn how to put up with these people that you've got to live with. And it's just honest about the mess sometimes of trying to live in Christian community. And yet I think it's equally inspirational and idealistic as it sets forth the positive qualities. And I kind of go with what Charlie was saying earlier on theologically, that all these fruit, because you could characterize these as fruit of the Spirit, a fruit of living in Jesus, as fruit of the life of the kingdom. I go with that they are born from the life of Christ and the Spirit within us. But if I'm a tree, it feels like hard work at times. I don't just find myself sitting here waiting for the pears to pop out. Sometimes learning to be kind and forgiving feels like giving birth. Not that I've ever given birth, but I've been a close observer on a couple of occasions, and it looks like hard work, I think. And I wonder whether there's something here about this passage which is reminding us that this stuff takes practice as well. So not denying what Charlie says about this is the outflow of the working of God within us. Nonetheless, we have to put off and put on. We have to get rid of and we have to appropriate. And things like forgiveness and things like forbearance and things like grace and speaking truth. For me, it takes practice. I have to keep coming back to it and try again and try again and try again and try again. And those fruits only come by sticking at it, by keeping working at it. And therefore, I find this encouraging for those reasons. Yeah.
Thanks. Charlie, do you want to respond?
I'd agree. I think that's why we're given instructions. I just think that often we just default straight to, I will become more holy or a nicer person or whatever if I just grit my teeth and try harder, as opposed to going always to the kind of to the root of the sin, which is I think what God does a lot of the time, these sort of heart attitudes. So actually, why is it that I'm angry with this person, or why is it that I'm struggling to be tenderhearted or to forgive them? Actually, I've got to go to the root. So you've got to do that work. But I think if we just try, then we will either we'll push important things aside, or we'll bottle up emotions or real problems. It's okay to sort of overlook someone being a bit irritating, but overlooking real hurt is likely to damage you. But the work, I think, the work is perhaps different. And I think it comes up a number of times in here where what's going on inside us is it's all about identity and the reality of who we are and what God has done for us. So as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, so live in love. So that's the kind of logical flow all the time. And so what is the way that I can deal with my temper, or what is the way that I can deal with my my hatred towards my brother? Actually, it's to go back to Jesus, and not in some over spiritualized, if all I do is I go to another 17 masses, I'll be okay. But actually to come back time and time again to God's love for me in Christ. And also, I think it's a community thing. One of the things I think we really lose by getting rid of these and thous is we lose any distinction between when you is plural and you is. And I think we need to understand all of these letters. And I'm continually banging this drum in our church. Almost all the instructions in the Bible are to God's people, not to me individually. So I can't say that in kind of, oh, it's your job to forgive me. I can't sort of do it like that. But actually, this is, put away falsehood. That isn't just you as an individual. That's as a community, put away falsehood. In your anger, do not sin. Well, actually, we know that if you're angry about something, you go and chunt it to a friend, and then they actually are angry too, you'll end up being even nastier about the person who's wronged you than, So actually, one of the things jobs might be to help one another in that. So again, that's not effortless. It's going to require that. But it's almost like the story that we tell and tell one another, the story that we believe, the story that we keep going back to has got to be a story of God's love and Christ's sacrifice for us. And that is then becomes the engine room of our moral and spiritual change.
Powerful stuff. Yes. I like it. We could say more. I'm just going to shuffle us into 2 Samuel. Is that all right? And then if there are other threads, we'll go. No, Glenn's going. I've got something really important to say.
One little thing before we go off to 2 Samuel.
Go.
Can I do that? Because the question, how would I preach on this? I'd be sorely tempted to ignore everything in the passage, apart from what is said to the thief. Because to me, that was the bit that was the most remarkable part of this. Not stop stealing and start working with your own hands. But why would you do that? You don't do it so that you can look after your own. You do it so that you can give away to others.
Yes.
And isn't that so different to the sort of kind of moralism that we tend to get trotted out in today's society, which is all about stop stealing and look after yourself, be self-responsible, be self-sufficient, look after you and your family. There's something quite radical about that. If you've got a thief, stop stealing so that you can earn money to give away. Yeah. And I'd be sorely tempted to play with that and to ignore the rest of it, I think.
That'll make Miranda happy because she's already said she's ignoring most of it, so that's all right.
Like Glenn, the bit that really stood out for me was the fact that there's something addressing thieves who have not yet stopped stealing. I mean, I just think that's fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't have the guts to stand up in my congregation and say, those of you who are thieves, stop stealing. I mean, it's just astonishing. Yeah. But you're right, that was one of the bits that leapt out at me, that the reason is to give it away. I mean, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, we touched on when we talked about this, the fact that life is messy and that church is messy, community is messy, which does bring us nicely to the very, very, very messy life of David. If you're with us last week, we did delve pretty well into a lot of the messiness of David's story. And this week, the lectionary kind of was mostly verses from 2 Samuel chapter 18, edited highlights. As you know, Anglicans can't listen to too much scripture in one hit as we go up in a puff of smoke. But essentially, this is Absalom, David's son, being killed. But the backstory, it's really worth reading all the chapters, I think, that go before. It involves the rape of Tamar. It involves Absalom killing his brother. It involves Absalom revolting against David. And then finally, this big battle happens. David says, don't hurt Absalom. Absalom gets killed and David weeps. Miranda, you have a thing about these difficult passages, don't you?
Yeah, a great story. Thanks for that little quick summary of the whole story that this is cut in. When we were just talking before we went live, I was saying if I was going to preach on all three readings, which I don't tend to do because I like to go into one and really delve into it, but if I was in a context where I was expected to preach on all three readings and come up with a theme, I'd be inclined to take the theme of conflict and what it does to communities, and look in the gospel at that, what everything we said about moaning and complaining. Obviously the Ephesians reading has that as a strong theme. Don't say things that are going to destroy the community, but things that are going to build up, that huge Pauline theme. And then in this reading you've kind of got this almost comical, I mean it's almost pantomime, it's like a Greek tragedy, this kind of ridiculous caricature of just what happens when conflicts are go unchecked and when people don't behave like that. And then actually in conflict, in war, in families that are at war with themselves, in situations where your whole family has been destroyed by the complex numbers of rapes and betrayals and so on that are dogging this family, there are no winners. Mm-hmm. There is no solution. And I mean, to me, you could preach a whole sermon about kind of pacifism and the futility of war based on this, because it really emphasizes in a very striking way, given that I think a lot of people's caricature of the Old Testament is it's all about God smiting people. Loads of people say, I like the God of love of the New Testament. I don't like the God of violence and war of the Old Testament. I hear that all the time. And a lot of people would sort of assume that really the Old Testament is all about battles and God being on the side of the victors. And they either like that or they don't like it. But it's very, very clear about just how unhelpful, unhappy war is. And this is a brilliant example of there is no results of this battle would have been a happy one. Oh. There was nothing that could happen once things had got to this point where everyone would have been happy. You can, if Absalom hadn't been killed, that this would have carried on forever. As it is, we go on to the next section, the generals are then furious that David's weeping over the loss of his son rather than congratulating them on their success in battle. And the repercussions continue. There's absolutely nothing that could be good. And so there's something really profound there about just how destructive conflict is, whether it's in a community or on a sort of national scale.
Yeah.
I think you could preach a sermon. You could preach a sermon on the crucifixion and on atonement based on this. There's something about that outpouring of David's emotion at the end. Oh, my son Absalom, my son, would I have died instead of you? This kind of desperate, that even this son who has rebelled against him, he's killed his eldest son. To be fair, his eldest son did rape a sister. But this son has killed another son. He's been exiled. He's come back. He's then fomented a rebellion. Now thousands of people have died in this forest. I mean, it's just a horrendous mess. And yet, David is absolutely bereft because he did still love him. Mm. And there's something to me there that as a Christian resonates quite strongly with the idea of God, while we were still sinners, dying for us and choosing to come and die, because this is a mess and humanity as a whole wasn't doing well. And yet that doesn't stop God loving and wanting to step into the mess and do something. So that, I mean, I don't think I will preach that, but you certainly could go in that direction. It was interesting, I did a little bit of looking up because I wondered whether any of the kind of medieval commentators who loved their parallels and their typologies and so on, whether any of them had done anything around Absalom hanging on a tree as a sort of type of Jesus. They didn't. But there was one 5th century commentator who described Absalom as prefiguring Judas, something about the betrayal and then the hanging. But that seems to have been a bit of an outlier.
Interesting.
But there certainly are resonances there, aren't there, with the betrayal and the hanging and the tree and, you know, the spear. There's certainly resonances with the story that I think as Christians make us think of that.
Yeah, and the verses that the lectionary leaves out are all a bit gruesome as well. All the hanging in the tree and the spearing by all of them. Glenn, are you particularly drawn to this passage, or would you sidestep it?
No, I'm drawn to it for a number of reasons. I mean, just one comment on the back of what Miranda's saying, if I might, and then I'll say why it is I'm drawn to it. Part of the irony, of course, is Absalom's name is the father of peace.
Oh, it's not, of course.
Which is profoundly ironic in this context, isn't it? Because in this bit of the narrative of the Hebrew people, peace is absolutely what they don't have. And I think my angle on this might be to take it as part of that bigger narrative that goes back to Judges. And I think my angle might be that, you know, kings aren't the answer. Kings aren't the answer. You've got that line in Judges, haven't you, that refrain that comes up that, you know, there was no king amongst them. Look at all the mess and all the stuff and all the horrible things that happened in Judges, and there was no king amongst them. And the implication being, well, that's why it went wrong. They didn't have a king. Hey, well, guess what? We've got a king now, and it's all fine now, isn't it? You know, everything's sorted.
Yes.
You know, so in the age of Trump and Johnson and Bolsonaro and that guy in Belarusia whose name I've forgotten, you know, the age where there are real risks of us turning to the strong man as the savior, powerful figure who will use his force and power to sort of bring us peace and to bring us well-being. I think this undermines that rather wonderfully. You know, so even this exemplar king, even a king whose heart is set on God, still ends up with I'm semi-public, so a poo storm of a nation happening around him. So I think I might be tempted to sort of kind of explore that a little bit with this, that strong men leaders aren't necessarily the answer, folks.
Sounds like a good sermon. We've sort of almost gone over time as well, but we'll stretch it another, say, 3 minutes or so. But so, Charlie, very quickly, do you have a reflection on this, or as you've listened to Miranda and Glenn?
Yeah, I think for me, I'd love to preach on this. If you're doing if you were following the story, I think to just pop in and try and explain this would just be baffling to people, because you'd spend half the time telling the story.
Yeah,
I think for me, it's the emotional heart of this, and this is where I think stories really do catch. And actually the bit that's skipped out it is actually about this desire of one chap, can't remember his name at the moment, who really wants to go and give the news.
Yes.
So he's like, oh, you know, and this is a bit of, we finally killed the baddie, we really want to go, you know, Joab disobeys and does the stabbing. Then Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, says, I want to go with the news. And there's this kind of back and forth and everything, but it's kind of like there's this emotional heart of, we've finally won, we've killed the baddie, you know, he was stabbed, it's gruesome, and they're expecting congratulations, and this is the prize, which is always, I think, the best place to stop in any parable or story. The surprise is David's response, and I think there actually it says a lot to us about wanting to win. I mean, I'm really aware that we've got that politically, we've already mentioned. I think we've also got it in different church denominations. When we are divided over significant things, we want to win. We want our side to come on top. We don't want to be particularly mean to the others. We don't want to hang them in a tree and stab them with spears, but we'd quite like, well, maybe we do. I don't actually sit on General Synod, but I think there is this kind of this sense of we want to win, and we want, and therefore actually we might even at times use some rather underhand or ungodly methods to try and do it, because we think the battle's so worthwhile. Or even actually here, where they are defeating evil. Absalom was a bad guy who'd done some terrible things and had destroyed pretty much the peace of the whole kingdom of Israel. I mean, he's terrible. He's a real baddie. And there's a kind of human thing. But then it comes, actually, I think at this point, David is the godly king. I think he made his massive mistakes earlier. He's not without mistakes later on. But I think actually this is God's reaction. God doesn't want to see people defeated, not in that way. Doesn't want to, there's no kind of relish. It's not like kind of watching Game of Thrones when the baddie finally gets burnt alive or their throat cut at a wedding. You kind of cheer. God is not bloodthirsty. Actually, God's thing is, you guys, and when he looks at the mess we've made, he doesn't look in sort of, kind of exasperated judgment. It's in sadness. There's a real sorrow. Like when we hurt one another, when the church pulls apart, it's really, really sad. And even when the good guys win, actually, it's still really sad. And here, I think, is David showing what it means to love your enemies. And Jesus came and loved his enemies. And I think that's where we do find, as Miranda said, that's where we do find the passion and the cross at the midst of this. It is that God sees the mess and sin in our lives and our world with longing, compassion, and tears. There's no kind of relishing of judgment. And I just think it's a real cautionary tale for us, really, about how things go wrong, but also about actually how God might well be viewing it.
That sounds like a perfect place to land it. We've dealt with a lot of gamut of human emotion. The scriptures are nothing if not very real. Okay. So I want to say thank you to my guests, but before I let them go, I always ask my guests, so if you are preaching on Sunday and you're in a lectionary context, what kind of sermon is shaping up for you? If not, if this was an imaginary exercise, we've had a conversation, we've looked at them, what kind of sermon might you go with if you were preaching at a church that gave you these readings to choose from on Sunday? We'll go to the Baptist last, give him a chance to gather his thoughts. Miranda, what about yourself? Are you looking at these texts on Sunday?
I'm actually not. But if I was, I genuinely don't know at this point, actually, because every time someone's talked about one of them, I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I could do on that. So jury's still out on where I'd go with it. I'd probably end up with the John reading, to be honest, because I think it's quite right that you probably need to be going through the whole process. Although I am quite drawn to the whole Game of Thrones style of the Absalom story. I love the way the forest is a character. The forest claims more victims than the sword. That's really sci-fi stuff, isn't it? But
I see a dramatic sermon being.
I probably wouldn't actually preach on that.
Thanks, Miranda. What about you, Charlie?
We are in John. We've chosen to focus on John this month. So what we tend to do in our church when we are following the lectionary, we tend as a team to go one way, not to repeat ourselves, but so that actually people have got a flow. And so we are basing most of our sermons around John. And so, yes, I will be talking about the fleshiness. I think the interest, the connection that God has, the way he values stuff, the physical world, the material world, and particularly human flesh, and how we are. He has honored human flesh by becoming one of us. And I think there's loads of Eucharistic overtones in there, and I think we should bring them out. I would be careful about drawing a direct line, but certainly it is definitely a reality of physical things pointing to being valuable in themselves, but leading us to Christ.
Okay, great sermon, Charlie. Glenn, as a Baptist looking in on us dear Anglicans, what would you go with if you had these passages?
Well, it's once said that one famous Baptist preacher only ever had one sermon. So he preached once on Genesis chapter 3, Adam in the garden, where Adam was, how Adam got there, and finally a few words about baptism. I'd resist that temptation. I'd resist the temptation, I think, or it would be a sore temptation to have a pop at materialism and individualism, using that line about the thief in Ephesians. I'd be sorely tempted to have a pop at kingship, using the Absalom passage, but I think in the end I'd give in and speak about Jesus again. And I go to John's Gospel, and I think I'd preach where I started at the beginning of this broadcast, which is Jesus as the one who sustains us to enable us to live the life of the age to come in the midst of this present rather messy reality. I think that's probably where I leave it.
Sounds wonderful. I shall have to book you, Glenn. Thank you, everyone. And I'm not preaching either. An ordinand on placement is preaching. I think like, yeah, all of you, I think it's too much of a gift to not preach when I am the bread of life, particularly when you are quite a Eucharistic church. And I was really struck earlier about the thing about sacramental theology that is for the whole of creation. So I think that's probably where I would end up shaping something up, but I haven't got to write it, which is always wonderful. So I want to say a huge thank you to Glenn, to Charlie, Miranda for giving up their time this Tuesday lunchtime. If you are around next week, I am back with returning faces, familiar faces to this diocese in John Barrett, who has a long title involved in mission and communications, and Andrew Race, who's a vicar based up at Castle Donington, and returning for the second time, Mother Roxanne Franklin Hunt, who is an Anglo-Catholic priest based down in London. So do join me same time next week for some more musing about the scriptures.